shame is real. It's super real. And I felt it so viscerally. And so it's hard when you see your kids struggling and your family and friends and community, their kids are moving forward in a way that you feel like you slipped and gone off in a different direction. My kid is double majoring and speaks French and spent the summer on the Italian Riviera or whatever. They have all these accomplishments. And like my kid is struggling to turn the homework in.
Right.
And so you feel judged and you feel like it's like you're a bad parent when you see that they're struggling with things that for you feel easy. It can feel like you did something wrong.
Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Arts, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opataya, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Hello and welcome to the show. Today's episode is about an artist's approach to explore the intersection between studying her father's work in ship salvage and raising a son with ADHD. I'm joined by writer and producer Elizabeth Rynecki, co-creator of That Sinking Feeling, a podcast about adventures in ADHD and ship salvage. Elizabeth is the author of the narrative nonfiction memoir, Chasing Portraits, a great-granddaughter's quest for her lost art legacy, for which she received a Kirkus-starred review. She wrote, produced, and appeared in the documentary film Chasing Portraits. She's been featured in the New York Times, being a guest on NPR affiliate stations, and being a speaker at bookstores, libraries, book festivals, and film screenings around the world. Elizabeth has a BA in rhetoric from Bates College and an MA in rhetoric and communication from UC Davis. She's working on a novel inspired by real events and lives in Oakland, California with her husband, 2 sons, and 3 black cats. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are very welcome. I'm very, very thrilled to get into today's conversation. When I received your pitch, I was like, oh, this is a memoir that's also a podcast, and that's so cool. So I'm always on the hunt for interesting ideas. So that immediately stood out to me. So I want to start by saying thank you for coming my way and setting us up for this.
Oh, well, before we started recording, you said that I think you sort of framed the question of why did you choose to make it a podcast instead of writing a book? And in fact, I did write a book and I tried to find an agent and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I had dinner with a friend who has been a documentary filmmaker for a long time. And he said, I want to read it. And so afterwards, he wondered maybe we could turn it into a podcast. And I love podcasts, especially storytelling ones, although also interview ones. And I thought that'd be a really cool idea. And I had narrated my documentary film. I did the voiceover. And so I felt comfortable and confident about being able to do that. But it also was a lot of work because writing for the page is incredibly different than writing for the spoken word, and also even different from the voiceover from the documentary film because the film has images with your words.
Right.
And in a podcast, if you're not saying something, there's dead air unless there's music.
Yeah.
And so that was a whole reinvention. But it also was a fun opportunity because it literally meant I could bring in other voices. So instead of just writing about my father telling me something, people could actually hear him say it.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was a fun project.
Amazing. I'm sure that it was, because the production's very good. It's very accessible. I love the storytelling. I love the music. I'm a musical person by nature, so I really love the music. I love the interludes with different people. There's your son, there's parents who have kids with ADHD, there are some professionals, there are spouses of people, with ADHD. So there's a wide variety of voices, and it feels very interactive and accessible, so that even if I'm not seeing it, I'm hearing it. I'm hearing the sounds of water and the ships, and yeah, it was just very well done. And thank you for taking the initiative to put your story out there, even though you weren't getting the kind of response that you wanted. Because I think one of the challenges that artists face is that we're constantly looking for that table. We're constantly looking to be invited on, to a platform, or, to get this, contract by this publishing house. We're constantly looking for people to give us opportunities, and I always love it when I see artists saying, okay, I wasn't given the opportunity, but I'm going to make my own opportunity. So
Yeah.
thank
I
you.
mean, it's definitely a privileged position to be able to have. So I am aware of that, but I also believe in going after the things that you love and that speak to you. And so one of the great things about the internet, which has many bad things about it, but one of the great things is that it gives you the ability to make your voice heard in ways that you might not have 30 years ago.
Right.
And so I've actually, I mean, while I have had a book published by a big five, my book was published by NAL, Penguin Random House. I've also self-published books. And actually, my documentary film is really a self-published thing. It wasn't until I was all done and had gone through lots of film festivals that I got distribution. And so the podcast felt like another component of that. And
Mm.
while we did try to pitch different podcast platforms, there's so many people vying for attention.
Yeah.
And we actually ultimately decided that being able to put it out in the world on our own gave us more control over it. We didn't have to
Yeah.
have advertisements in it. It could be as long or as short as we wanted it to be. We could use the
Yeah.
music we wanted to. And so we had more artistic control. And
Yeah.
so it turned out, I think, to be a blessing in disguise. But the podcasting space, as I'm sure you're well aware, is very noisy and
Yeah.
it's hard to get traction and it's hard to be heard. And so it's exciting that people like you are offering spaces for relatively unknown people to tell their stories a little bit. So thank
Yeah.
you for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're welcome. And I totally get that. I think as someone who is also an artist, and constantly struggling to find opportunities to share something that's a bit different from what people are, from what's popular in the market. I think that we talk about neurodivergence a lot, but I often think about artists who are divergent in ways that can be almost uh, almost harmful to their careers. Harmful, and I use that word very lightly because I can't find another word. But you are chasing ideas that, I'm not talking about you specifically, but there are artists who want to talk about something that is not popular in mainstream media, and they have really given it some deep thought. They've created something beautiful, but there's no space for them because it doesn't sound like what other people want to hear. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who would love to listen to that. If 5 million people would listen to something that's in mainstream media, maybe 100 people will listen to that deeply thought, piece of art. And maybe that's enough for the artist, the fact that somebody can listen to it. So that's what I'm always mindful of when I invite guests on the show. So I'm glad that you found a space on the show.
Yeah, me too. And I think one of the things we were also thinking about is that so much of the one of the phrases we use in the podcast is the social media marketplace of ideas. And
Right.
around neurodivergence and especially ADHD and autism, there's a lot of prescriptive advice and solution oriented, which is great and important. And I'm not dismissing that. But we also felt like there needs to be a descriptive place,
Right.
a thing. and what we hoped, and I think we did this, is because of some of the feedback we've gotten, is people just wanted to feel heard and understood. And so to share my story, and the whole idea of nothing about us without us, so inclusive of other people, so they would say, "Oh my gosh, that speaks to me. I feel heard," because there's
Yeah.
something about that is comforting and reassuring, and so
Yeah.
important that it be out there. And I think
Yeah.
that it's in all forms of art, is part of what you're saying, is that we need to see ourselves in other people, and sometimes those ideas are not totally mainstream,
Yeah.
and so
Absolutely.
that makes it even more important that we do them.
Absolutely. Well, as always, here's a reminder that you can find Journey of the Art wherever you get your podcasts. So please follow and rate the show and leave a comment. This really helps us to boost our visibility so more folks like you can discover and join the community. Also, if you'd like to stay connected, you can follow the show on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. So, Elizabeth, speaking of things that we can be proud of, things that are important to us that are not um, mainstream, I feel like we should walk back a little bit and talk about, just give our listeners or our viewers a general sense of what this series is about. So, the podcast That Sinking Feeling is a 6-part podcast series on the intersection between studying your father's work and raising your son, Owen, who has been diagnosed with ADHD. And in part 1 of the series, you said, I began to see my son's ADHD through the lens of ship salvage. How did you start to make this connection?
A very fair question, because it is an odd connection. So when I finished my Chasing Portraits book and film, I decided I needed a new project. And I like projects that are very specific to me and that nobody else can steal out from under me. So I
Mm,
don't want to write about politics and stuff on the front page of the newspaper, because journalists are going to do that. I'm not fast enough. I'm not knowledgeable enough. So I wanted to do something that was in my space that I felt really comfortable about. And
mm,
I grew up the daughter of a ship salvage engineer, and I heard stories about jobs that my dad worked on, and I used to visit his office and see his telex machine and see drawings of ships and hear him practice talks that he would give at conventions about ship salvage. And
mhm,
so I knew that there was something in that space, but I didn't quite know what, because I am not a ship salvage engineer or a maritime expert. And so I didn't want to write sort of an academic treatise about it. And while I was sorting through his stuff and trying to understand that, my son at the same time was having this meltdown. And I, for some reason, started to just kind of see the two together.
mm,
The metaphors in some of the salvage jobs started to explain some of the things about my son.
mm.
And so I just thought, well, how could I take this further? Like, what
Right.
other metaphors might I see? And so I started asking my dad more pointed questions about what jobs were his most memorable, or the hardest, or the biggest, or the most challenging. And then within those, I looked at the things going on in my son's life and tried to understand them through that lens.
Mhm.
And I think it's quirky enough that people sort of stop and say, "What?" And I always hope that that's the hook.
Yeah.
And the people I've heard back from have said, "I don't know how you did it. It's like magic, but it works." And so
Yeah.
we feel very excited. And I keep saying we because my podcasting partner is Tony Kaplan, and was very integral in helping to make it happen. So, I did the original writing, but he did tons of editing, and was involved in all the interviews. And so together we worked about how do we best tell this story, both in
Right.
terms of the story arc of the whole series and specific episodes and specific moments, and where the music goes to help amplify different, um, what would you call them? Like junctures in the
Right.
storytelling.
Right. I think it all worked out very well.
Thank you.
And yes, you're correct. The metaphors are very, very strong because when you listen to the podcast and you hear about all these highs and lows, it's pretty much the story of ship salvage, right? And the highs are high, the lows are really low, just as much as it would be for a ship salvage. Um, and one of the things that you talk about, or what you start us off with in the podcast, is your frustrations with the education system. And you mentioned, though, that you understand the concerns of the school, but you understand that you're also grappling with what felt like a rejection of your son. And I know you talked about this on the podcast, but can you share a little about ADHD school support and some challenges that parents are going through?
So, first, I have to confess that my son is now in his 20s. So, those grade school years are definitely behind us, but a lot of them are still super vivid. And I think, I mean, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which, if you're going to live anywhere and get emotional support for having a kid who's neurodivergent, it's probably the Bay Area. And yet, a lot of people don't understand ADHD. And I didn't either. It took me a really long time to understand what was going on with my son. A lot of teachers think ADHD is about fidgeting and an inability to focus and being sort of loud and distracted. And while that certainly is a piece of ADHD, there are a lot more things that make up ADHD. And one of the things that was really hard for my son was social emotional regulation. And so he would get upset and he would kind of explode.
Mm.
And teachers didn't know what to do with that. And the explosions could be anything from storming out of a classroom, which, if you're a little kid, is not safe. A teacher doesn't know where you're going, throwing a chair, threatening a kid, a classmate. Clearly, those are problems. And teachers, I think today, there's so much on their shoulders and they're burdened with so many responsibilities. And so that's distracting to them in the classroom. And so
Right.
the instinct is to say, your kid has to leave the classroom. Your kid needs to be suspended for a day, 2 days, a week until they learn a lesson to behave better. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for kids with ADHD. It probably doesn't really work for a lot of kids anyway. Um, I wish I had a magical solution that I could offer to teachers to say, here's what you should do instead. But I think that just understanding that social emotional dysregulation, um, difficulty in executive function. So a classic story, and I think this is in the podcast, is this idea of the kid does their homework. You even hire a tutor to help them get the homework done, or a parent helps them, and it goes in the backpack and it goes to school and it doesn't get turned in. And there's this
Mm.
idea that the kid is willfully and purposefully not turning it in to, I don't know what, be be difficult on purpose, but they really just forgot. It's really an ADHD struggle. And so the best sorts of teachers have always understood my kids' challenges. And so oftentimes he's pushed back. He thinks an assignment is stupid. He doesn't want to do it. Okay, well, if you don't want to, if the real assignment, the goal is to write an essay.
Mhm.
If the essay topic, are topics A or B, give my kid a different option. Let him pick something else because the goal is to write the essay, not that it has to be about A or B. So I think that the hope in a 529 plan or an IEP are those sorts of accommodations.
Right.
And squeezing a fidget toy in class or bouncing your leg or being allowed to pace, those are some accommodations, but accommodations need to be wider because the needs are so diverse.
And one of the speakers talked about parents not knowing what's available for them to help their kids. What are your thoughts on this? Because there is a there's what's the ideal, and that's for the school to, I guess, provide more support for kids with ADHD. But in the real world, not many schools have the infrastructure or the culture to be able to make those changes. So, if parents were to look for some of these solutions for themselves, what would you say are some of the things that are available to them that they're not aware of, what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that it's complicated, and
Mm,
I do want to answer your question, but I also just want to be clear that I am not an ADHD coach, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a licensed medical doctor, so these are just my sort of punting experiences.
mhm,
I do think that there's a lot available on the internet. I think that organizations like um, Attitude Magazine has an
right.
online website. So, ADHD used to be called ADD, and so they kept their name of their publication. So it's ADD Etude, so Attitude. I feel like I've just now given them a big promotional advertisement. But they have a lot of great resources. I don't use TikTok. I've heard some controversial things about the kind of advice that's there. I
Mhm,
do follow people on Instagram that I have found educational in terms of, oh, that's my kid's ADHD.
right.
I actually have a page on my website that has some resources, and I'm sure you can drop that in your show notes, that has links to other people. There are experts who have all sorts of YouTube talks available. Um, so I do think that, if a school can't get behind you, at least maybe at home, you can provide those kinds of supports. And sometimes that's the hardest because
Mm,
your kid, in a perfect world, home is a safe space.
right.
And that means that at the end of a long day, after your kid has masked up and done their best to be more neurotypical in in a world that expects them to behave in a certain way, they're going to come home and melt down, and they're
Mm,
going to take it out on you. And that's really, really hard. It is emotionally exhausting for everybody. So I think you have to cut yourself a bit of slack and give them love because they
mm,
need that more than anything else. And the hard times are, like, maybe they'll be a little different, but there will always be hard days. And so
right.
the important thing is to try to have a good relationship with your kid,
Yeah.
because it's so easy to blow up that relationship and destroy it. And more than anything, they need that from you.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you're saying about love. Because as I was listening to the podcast and making these connections between the metaphors, your dad talks about not getting simple jobs, but only getting complex salvage situations and how difficult that was. And in the same way, you were faced with raising Owen through his experience with ADHD. And we see that each episode focuses on a shipwreck, and each wreck is different and a different approach is needed. And just as your dad had to find strategies to salvage worst case scenarios, you've had to find strategies to help Owen. So I love what you're saying to me about, they'll come home and you kind of need to be their safe space. And sometimes they want you to be their safe space. And I'm guessing sometimes you're the one that they're lashing at. So it's finding different strategies for different situations. Um, in part 5, you talk about the difficulty of giving your son ADHD medication, but also recognizing that he needed an anchor so he could live independently, to a great degree. And the medications didn't help as much as you had hoped, and I dare say maybe as much as he had also hoped. And it seems that this affected his life in different ways that he's had to stop and maybe start new ones. So, what's the one thing that you can share about this experience and how parents navigating this difficult decision can handle it?
Mental health challenges are real, and medications there are medications that are available to parents.
Mm.
And if your kid is old enough to be part of that discussion, I definitely think they should be. I think you also should, you know, look at what your doctors are telling you. And unfortunately, and this is said in the podcast by a licensed doctor, it is a matter of trial and error.
Mm.
And that's a bummer because we want to, we have a broken arm and we put it in a cast to get it fixed. And that's what we want. We want it fixed. And ADHD doesn't work like that. The medications, different medications help different people in different ways, and it can be profound.
Right.
And we have certainly noticed medications help our son immensely, but it never goes away. It is
Right.
always, the ADHD is always there. And sometimes the medications have side effects. They make you nauseous or they make you tired, or you get through the day really well, but then you crash after the med sort of is out of your system. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are all these things to consider, and that can be hard. But I definitely believe in medications. I do think that there can be a stigma attached to it. I
Right.
think we are moving as a society, we're moving away from that. There's so many people who are more vocal about their mental health challenges.
Right.
And I think that that's important because that makes it easier for other people to face their own difficulties and be willing to do something about them that's more than just, trying to white knuckle it. Maybe white
Right.
knuckling's not the right phrase, but to like, just sort of bear down through it
Mm-hmm.
with no support. And so you need family support, you need community support, and meds can be part of that scaffolding.
Right. Right. So one of the things that you talk about that's closely related to this idea of parents finding the right medication for their children is shame. That was probably one of the hardest episodes to listen to because every parent, said maybe not the same thing, but it was the same idea of this is something that I'm struggling with, and it's not. Somebody said something so insightful about embarrassment is something that sort of happens to you, and shame is something that's more internal. And so parents are helping their kids navigate their mental health issues, but they themselves are, are I would say, having to look after their own mental health because when you're navigating shame, that's something that's really internal. Why was it important for you to talk about? I mean, I feel like I have an idea, but I want to give you space to talk about why it was important for you to call out the fact that parents feel a lot of shame.
Shame is real. It's super real. And I felt it so viscerally. Like, I, I have friends who have kids who have mental health struggles. I also have friends whose kids' mental health struggles are pretty minor. They're there, but they sort of function at a in a their lives are very different.
Right.
And so it's hard when you see your kid struggling and your family and friends and community, their kids are moving forward in a way that you feel like you've slipped and gone off in a different direction.
Hmm.
And that can be hard because I think we all compare ourselves,
Right.
which I think sometimes can be good if it motivates you to be like, oh, this person made a painting. I've always wanted to make a painting. I could do that. She did that. I could do that too. That's empowering.
Hmm.
But the whole like, my, I'm speaking as somebody else. My kid, I think actually the thing we said in the podcast was, my kid is double majoring and speaks French and spent the summer on the Italian Riviera or whatever. They have all these
Hmm.
accomplishments. And like my kid is struggling to turn the homework in.
Right.
And so you feel judged and you feel like it's like you're a bad parent
Hmm.
when really your kid is their own person. Like they
Hmm.
arrive in your life and they have they're their own little person. They have their
Right.
own personality, their own traits, their own way of seeing the world. And it is your job and responsibility as a parent to guide them as best you can, to
Mm-hmm.
give them access to books and to parks and to summer camp opportunities and to taste different foods and to open the world to them, but you can't make them somebody that they're not. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you see that they're struggling with things that for you feel easy, it can feel like it can feel like you did something wrong.
Right.
And it's really important to know that you didn't.
Yeah.
And to in addition to giving your kids some love, you got to give yourself a little bit of love
Yeah.
and let go and support them for who they are.
Yeah. So the other thing that is closely related to shame is, I would say, a theme of fear. And you talk about how someone on the one of the guests talks about the school to prison pipeline being a real fear for parents of kids with behavioral problems. And I think it was your husband who was saying that there's a fear that, like, worst case scenario, he's 40 and he's living in the basement. Um, Obviously that's not going to happen, but that is the worst case scenario. So there's a thread of shame and a thread of fear that's going on. Um, do you have any thoughts on how parents can navigate that aspect of fear? Because I know your husband's approach is, he's a very optimistic person. Like, that comes through very strongly. He's like, I'm going to take you one day at a time. So maybe I'm answering my own question, but I'm going to give you a chance to answer that.
I think that my husband has a little bit of ADHD. He's never been formally diagnosed. So I think he just intuitively understands our son in ways that I don't always get.
Mm,
I, for a long time, used to say we're running out of runway. And my husband would say, well, we need to build a longer runway.
mm,
And I think that's starting to work out. Like, I think Tony and I are actually working on a bonus episode, and Owen is almost done with his community college credits and is hoping to take the next steps, whatever that is. We don't know exactly, but a lot of, I think people in general, the brain doesn't fully develop until they're like 25. And
right.
so he's not there yet and he needs a little more time. And actually, it's interesting. I mean, when I was a kid and I went away to college, I never really went home again. I spent, I think, maybe one summer at home again. And kids these days, they're not doing that. I
Mm,
mean, for various reasons, social, emotional ones, the economy,
yeah.
rental rates, that's part of the economy, jobs. So a lot of parents are seeing kids come home. And I think it's not quite as unusual as it was. And
Right.
in other cultures, of course, it's completely common. The the culture in the States has been, you're 18, get out of the house.
Yeah.
Um, so, the fear, I think, can be real, but I also, again, it's sort of altering your perspective and changing your expectations. So every family has to make their own decisions about what that looks like.
Right.
But I think being open to it is more healthy than just saying no,
Right.
because you want your kid in the long run to succeed, and I think that that's part of building the longer runway.
Hmm. So, Elizabeth, I want to talk a little bit about producing this work, and some of the effort that you put into it, because I see that a lot of effort was put into it, a lot of heart, a lot of love. In fact, I was thinking this is such a labor of love, um, and I want to start with the first thing I noticed when I started listening to it, because when I received your pitch, the first thing I did was I went to look for the podcast, and I heard the first, like, I would say 2 minutes, and I was like, okay, I'm sold. Um, and so the first thing that I heard the thing I felt was a distinct sense of calm and clarity, not just in your enunciations, but in your very words. and you seem to have grasped the concept of writing for connection. How did you acquire this skill?
Oh boy. Practice, editorial help. So, like I said, I did write and deliver the voiceover for the documentary film. So,
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't completely foreign to me. My podcasting partner, Tony Kaplan, also he has a master's degree in documentary filmmaking. He actually worked at Pixar making documentary film components for them for 20 plus years. So he has a really good ear for that. So a lot of times I would write these really long sentences, and Tony would say, the idea is okay, but we've got to break it up. It's far too long. There are too many clauses. It's too hard to parse. And I went to grad school, and I have this tendency to be more academic-y, and I still tend to go there. So it's a practice of writing it and then getting rid of that stuff,
Mm,
because that's not how people talk.
right.
And then I only did one, but there's a woman in San Francisco that coaches and trains people to do voiceover delivery for everything from corporate films to advertisements. And I went to her, and because we had been recording, and I was like, it sounds too stiff. And
Mm,
what kind of advice can you give me? And she spent like an hour with me and gave me a lot of different ideas. And there were like 3 ideas that Tony and I ran with. And so I'm glad to hear that it feels accessible and calm. And because those were all things that we wanted. We wanted it to sound like I sound now versus
yeah,
like my reading something formally.
right, right. That really came through. That really came through. The other thing I noticed is that the project involves a lot of people. So, like I said, there's your husband, there's your son, there are parents of, children with ADHD, spouses of people living with ADHD. How did you balance the hard aspects of parenting and sharing information that people need?
So the story you're alluding to this, it's really an interwoven story. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see me, but I'm
Yeah.
weaving my hands in and out because that part was really, really hard.
Mm,
And Tony kept pushing me. He wanted to outline. And I am unfortunately not an outliner. I write to figure out what it is that I'm saying. And so Tony and I talked a lot about beats. So, like, as in a music beat. So I would say something, and then we realized, well, I could say this thing, or we would remember that we had interviewed somebody who said it better or with more emotion or more storytelling. And so it just became kind of I'm not a music composer, but it's a similar kind of idea.
right,
There's a rhythm and a beat to providing other voices in it.
right.
And we had an early piece that we made, we had somebody listen to it, and he said something like, it's too repetitive. Like I would say
Mm,
something and then somebody else would say totally different words, but it would be the same thing I said. So we realized, okay, we have to get rid of a little bit more of me and just have these other people there. So how do you it's basically a tee up. How do you
yeah,
tee up so that their comment or the thing that they're explaining makes sense? You have to contextualize them.
right.
And that was especially true since we didn't introduce people. So that we called it a chorus of voices. In part that was because there were some people who were talking about their kids who wanted to remain anonymous, and just we wanted to protect people's identity because these things are sensitive and
Right,
people didn't exactly know what we were making. And so they said, okay, I could be in it, but only if you use my first name. And so we just decided that we would credit them at the very end of the episodes. But within the episode, we didn't want distractors of introducing who this person was and how they came to the topic and what their kid specifically was struggling with. We just wanted them to weigh in on these concepts that we were presenting.
right, right. And it's very interesting that you pointed that out because I noticed that and I was like, why are they not introducing the people? Because then I was in my head trying to remember the voice. But then I realized, and that's what you're saying to me now, that the story was more important than the storyteller in a sense. Not that the storyteller isn't important, but the story took precedence. So I think that was very well done. So thank you for sharing that. Which of the episodes, so this is a two-part question. Which of the episodes have resonated with you, with your audience, and what has that meant to you? I'm gonna ask the second part of the question when you answer the first part.
Oh my gosh. I'm not even really sure. I I think that for me I like the later episodes more just because I feel like we finally figured out what we were really doing. I
Mm,
mean, I do feel episodes 1, 2 and 3 are super strong, but 4, 5 and 6 just felt like now we know what we're doing. And actually it's interesting I mentioned we're making this bonus episode and when you start something, you start with the blank page. And I thought, oh no, I don't remember how to do this because you have to, it's a new episode and new
yeah,
pieces. And there were some elements that were very similar, but it was just, you're not reinventing the wheel, but you're starting over again.
yeah,
Um, I am not sure that I've actually heard anybody say, oh, my favorite episode was this one. Although I think what my favorite opening is the episode about medications.
mm,
And I love, so for anybody who hasn't listened to it, it's a whole chorus of voices naming a whole bunch of medications. And I just love that because I think I don't know, it's sort of musical hearing all the different voices
right.
and the idea of being overwhelmed by all the different medications that are available. And so I thought that that was really beautiful. And then we actually did a similar thing in an episode where we talked about, and actually it might have been the first episode, I'm blanking, about all the sorts of people involved in helping you navigate ADHD. So
I think that was the first episode.
yeah. So, but we actually came up with the idea in the medicine episode first. So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it's right
Oh
backwards. But
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, that was a really nice one because it was like a chorus, different people. Somebody would say psychiatrist, somebody would say pediatrician. Yeah, yeah, that was really nice. Yeah, I blanked out for a second because I was reliving the moment.
no, that's okay. Yeah. So I like those two moments a lot.
Yeah. So let's talk about the music. Um, as a musical person, that really, was one of the things that caught my attention. There were moments of pause, like you would pause, there would be no music, and then there'll be a slight swell where you're talking about something that's important, and then it'll cut out again to the sound of waves, and it was just really nicely done. I know that you've kind of said that your partner Tony, um, it was probably the brains behind what kind of music to use and all of that kind of stuff. But can you talk a little bit about how you selected music for this production?
Yes. And I will preface it by saying I'm not super musical. And that part was the hardest part for me. I really let Tony take the lead on that. The funny thing I think about music and podcasts or even movies is when it's not working, but when there's a blank space, I couldn't tell you, oh, it needs a string quartet, it needs a
Right,
piano, it needs jazz. Like I don't have that skill
right,
set. Um, but we had music. So we worked with a sound engineer in Berkeley that did the sound engineering actually for my documentary. So I was very familiar with them. They, the person that runs their organization, um, let us use some of his original music cues. And so that was great. Tony also accessed some music cues online that are through I forget what the websites are, but they're oh maybe it was Pixabay. Anyway, there's like free sound.
right.
And then in our bonus episode, we actually just learned that Moby has made some music free for people. And so we're looking at some of those. And again, I'm sort of leaving it to Tony. I recorded my
Mm-hmm.
voiceover the other day and now he's editing all the different chorus of voices and then we'll have
Mm-hmm.
to go put the music in. It is the idea of giving space for people to process what they've just heard. So
Right.
I listen to most of my podcasts while I'm walking or driving my car. And so
Right.
you can't compact everything in. You need to give people breathing room, and
Yeah.
you can't have dead air in a podcast. So you do need either those sound effects, and you have to be careful because you don't want them to be super cliche. So it's a special talent that I do not have. And so I'm super grateful to be able
Mm-hmm.
to work with Tony and our sound engineers who've helped us find a good balance for all that.
Okay. So, Elizabeth, we've come to the last question. And my last question is going to be this: how has producing this podcast series affected you personally? I know that it has been a mixture of several things. It's been studying your dad's work in um, ship salvaging. It's been, I guess, evaluating or reevaluating your parenting journey with Owen. Um, it's probably also reevaluating your marriage in light of parenting Owen, meeting all these individuals and families who are also navigating the same issue. Now that the podcast is out in the world, I know you're preparing a bonus episode, but what has it done for you personally?
I think it's done all the things you just mentioned. So it's not that the podcast itself has improved my relationship with Owen, but it's kind of like I went on this big research adventure. And the more I dug into it and the more I had to edit lines, and Tony would say, "Is that really what you want to say?" In some ways, I tease Tony that he has been kind of like a therapist, pushing me. Well, what did that mean? Well, why did Owen say that? Well, why are you thinking about it this way? Really engaging me to think about my relationship with Owen and how I understand the ADHD in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so that whole experience has, I think, made me a better mom and definitely improved my relationship with Owen. We still bicker, don't get me wrong, but we have more moments where it's positive, and he knows that I'm trying. And in fact, he's listened to the whole podcast, and
Oh,
I think he learned a lot. He gave me a lot of hugs after the last episode. Like,
oh, that's
I
so
think,
sweet.
yeah, I think he and I both have come a long way, because even though you have ADHD, you don't necessarily know what it means. You're learning yourself. So he's learned a
Mm-hmm.
lot in the process too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my husband and I don't bicker about it nearly as much as we used to. I mean, again, we have days where I'm like, I don't get it, but it's much more solid. We've also been together almost 30, well, we've been married for almost 30 years. We've been together longer. So, we've like navigated this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's given me more time with my dad, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. My dad is 88, and I feel lucky that he is spry and goes out and does a whole bunch of things out in the world, and I get to spend time with him, and that's really special. So
Yeah.
it was I've been calling myself a memoirist and working in these different spaces, and it's nice to have that family legacy and those connections.
Yeah.
That's super rewarding.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I've enjoyed the insight you've shared with me today. I've enjoyed listening to those insights, and I enjoyed the warmth and the depth of thinking that that's so evident in your work. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that your podcast is available on Apple Podcasts. Is it available elsewhere?
It's available everywhere.
Perfect. Okay.
And if you can't find it, there are links on my website to several different sources where you can listen to it.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
You're welcome. On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.